Mary spent 8 long years scraping together every dime for her daughter's lavish wedding, only to be kicked out because of her old dress. But when those ballroom doors slammed shut, her heart didn't just break. It literally began to stop beating. Hello, dear listeners. I'm Casey. Where is the line between a mother's endless grace and her own quiet suffering? Today, we share Mary Clark's story, a painful journey of a woman reclaiming her right to matter, even as her body and loved ones turn away. Let's sit together and listen to the moment she realizes how blind love led her to the edge. I stood there in the middle of the magnificent Westlake Hotel ballroom, my fingers tightly gripping the $3 million check. This piece of paper was the culmination of 8 years of grueling labor, of sweating on dusty construction sites, since the day my husband passed away. I had spent every waking moment dreaming of this very second, just to see my daughter Dila glowing in the exquisite wedding gown that I had paid for with every cent I owned. But the warmth of that happiness vanished the instant Dila laid eyes on me. Her gaze held no affection, no gratitude, only a cold, sharp disgust directed at my old navy blue dress, the only keepsake I had left from her father's funeral. "You are ruining the mood, Mother." Dila's words felt like a jagged blade driven straight into my chest. Before I could even catch my breath, Leroy, the son-in-law I had supported for so long, stood on the stage and laughed. He made a cruel joke about people who didn't know their place, mocking my clothes, as if they were a relic from a decade he wanted to forget. The crowd erupted in laughter, a wave of noise that made my ears ring. A sudden jolt of electricity shot down my spine, and my chest constricted so tightly it felt like an invisible hand was squeezing the life out of me. I tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt thick, like I was trying to inhale lead. My legs began to tremble, not from fear, but from a far more brutal betrayal by my own body. My left arm went completely numb, and that $3 million check nearly slipped from my cold, unresponsive fingers. I looked at Dila, desperately hoping she would notice my pale face or the way I was swaying, but she had already turned her back on me to accept a glass of champagne from Leroy. I stumbled out toward the parking lot, every single step feeling as heavy as a mountain. As I finally collapsed into my old Camry, the oppressive silence of the night wrapped around me like a shroud. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead, stinging my eyes. I looked into the rearview mirror and saw a stranger staring back, a woman whose light had finally flickered out. My heart throbbed with a pain that went beyond the humiliation. It was the realization that I was simply done. "Please, not now," I whispered to the empty car, as the edges of my vision began to dissolve into a terrifying, encroaching darkness. The harsh white neon lights of the Mayo Clinic emergency room burned into my eyes, a stinging reminder of how quickly a life can shift. Just a few hours ago, I was standing in the amber glow of the Westlake ballroom, surrounded by the scent of expensive roses and bubbling champagne. Now, the only thing filling my lungs was the sharp, sterile bite of disinfectant. I lay there on a bed, draped in stiff white sheets, listening to the steady rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. It sounded like a countdown clock, ticking away the seconds of the independence I had spent 60 years building. The elderly doctor looked down at my chart, then over the rims of his glasses, with a gaze that felt far too heavy. "Mrs. Clark," he began, his voice a professional rumble that carried the weight of a sentence. "What you experienced was a transient ischemic attack, or a TIA. It is a mini-stroke, but more importantly, it is a final warning. Your body has reached its breaking point from years of sustained high stress. You are going to need a consistent caregiver at least for the next few months to monitor for any complications. I stayed silent. That phrase, need a caregiver, echoed in my mind like a hollow bell. For 6 decades, I had been the architect of my own life. I was a contractor who stood firm on dusty, windswept construction sites, managing crews and making hard decisions. I was the mother who carried every financial burden for my daughter without a second thought. And now, I was facing a future where I might not even be allowed to boil a pot of water or use the restroom alone. It felt like being stripped of my uniform and sent to the sidelines. I reached out with a trembling hand to the phone on the bedside table. I checked it, hoping against hope for a missed call or even a single text from Della. Nothing. Not a word to ask if I had made it home safely after she had cast me out like a criminal in front of her friends. The fear of becoming a burden to my children suddenly dissolved into a much more bitter truth. I was not their burden. I was simply invisible. I was a tool that had been used until its edge was dull and then tossed into the scrap heap. When it came time to process my discharge paperwork using my Medicare card, my fingers shook so much I could barely hold the pen. I looked the doctor in the eye and made a quiet, firm request. I asked him to keep the severity of my diagnosis strictly confidential. I did not want Della or Leroy to know I was vulnerable. I knew their nature too well. To them, my weakness would not be a reason for compassion, but a piece of bait for their cruelty. I drove my old Camry home through the deep silence of the night. The large Westlake house loomed in the darkness, looking cold and hollow. I walked into the living room, where a framed photo of Della on her graduation day still hung on the wall. She looked so radiant, so full of promise. I stared at her smile and wondered how long it would take for them to notice if I simply did not wake up tomorrow. Would it take days? Or would they only come knocking when they realized the $3 million check had not been replaced? A single hot tear rolled down my cheek as I locked the door behind me. In the shadows of that empty house, a quiet, cold plan began to take shape. The next morning, the Westlake sun poured through the curtains in a harsh yellow glare that felt far too bright for the emptiness of the room. I woke up in my own bed, but my chest still felt heavy with the echoes of the night before. There were no urgent phone calls from Della demanding wedding favors, and no more ridiculous requests from Leroy. I took a slow, deep breath and felt a strange sense of relief, knowing that $3 million check was now just a pile of shredded paper in a hospital trash can. But when I tried to swing my legs over the side of the bed, my body reminded me that this battle was just beginning. A wave of dizziness hit me, and for a second, I felt completely paralyzed by the realization that I was no longer the woman who could command a construction crew. I managed to slide my feet into my favorite Skechers, the ones with the extra arch support that used to be my armor on the job site. My breakfast routine had shifted too. Instead of grabbing a quick coffee on the way to a site, I sat down to a low-sodium meal to manage my blood pressure, just like the pharmacist at CVS had warned me to do. The hardest part was the pill bottle for my calcium and vitamin D. My hands, which once held heavy power tools and blueprinted dreams, were now trembling as I struggled with a tiny plastic cap. It took me nearly 5 minutes of fumbling and sweating just to get one tablet out, and the sheer helplessness of it made me want to scream. Then Della pushed the door open, her face a mask of exhaustion that had nothing to do with worrying about me. She looked like the weight of her unpaid wedding bills was finally crushing her spirit. "Mom, why are you doing that yourself?" she snapped, grabbing the bottle from my hand so roughly that 3 pills scattered across the hardwood floor. I watched her eyes dart toward the driveway, probably hoping to see a bank courier with a replacement check instead of having to pick up medicine for her old mother. She used that tone, the one that made me feel like an inconvenience in my own home. "I can do it myself, Dila," I said, my voice sounding colder and steadier than I felt. She froze, her eyes flashing with a resentment she didn't bother to hide. She started complaining about how she had to cancel her luxury Caribbean honeymoon just to stay home and watch me, even though she had spent the entire morning scrolling through Amazon. She was acting like her presence was a grand sacrifice, while she ignored my actual needs. I sat there, sipping my black coffee, enjoying the bitter sting on my tongue. I was learning to live with this new physical weakness, but I was also learning how to build a wall around my heart to protect it from people who only saw me as an ATM. I felt a quiet sense of power as my hand brushed the legal folder on the table, the one my lawyer had quietly sent over last night. Have you ever felt like a loved one's care was actually just a calculated move, or a burden they wanted you to feel guilty for? What do you think about Dila's reaction to her mother's sudden strength? Should we keep quiet for the sake of family? Or is it time to set boundaries like Mary did? Please share your thoughts and tell me your story in the comments below. The kitchen that once served as the heart of my home, where I spent decades preparing massive Thanksgiving dinners for our family and friends, has suddenly been transformed into a cold, high-security control zone managed by my daughter Dila. In the wake of that terrifying morning at the hospital, it seems Dila has completely forgotten who I am. She no longer sees Mary Clark, the woman who stood her ground on dusty, sun-scorched construction sites across Texas for 8 years, managing crews and making the hard calls that kept our lives afloat. Instead, she looks at me like I'm a fragile piece of antique glass that might shatter if the wind blows too hard, or an object that requires constant 24/7 surveillance. Every single movement I make is tracked by her sharp, judgmental eyes, and the silence in this big Westlake house is no longer the peaceful quiet I used to cherish. It has become a heavy, suffocating pressure, the kind of stillness that only comes when you are being watched and waited upon by someone who doesn't truly care for your well-being. Early this morning, I had a simple plan: to drive my old Camry to the construction company office because I needed to look over the supply contracts that represent my life's work. Those files are more than just paper to me. They are the physical proof of my independence and the legacy I intended to leave behind. But when I reached for the spare keys on the hallway shelf, my fingers met nothing but empty space. Dila stepped into the hallway at that exact moment, holding a blood pressure monitor like it was a weapon of authority, her voice sounding flat and rehearsed as she told me she had taken the keys. She claimed the doctor said I was in no condition to drive, and that from now on, she or Leroy would be the ones to take me wherever I needed to go. I felt the heat of a sudden flush creep up my neck and into my face. Driving that car was about more than just getting from point A to point B. For a woman my age in a place like Texas, it is the ultimate symbol of freedom. I told her, as calmly as I could, that I was sick, not mentally incompetent, and that she needed to stop treating me like a child who cannot look after herself. I gripped the edge of the wooden table to steady my hands, which were beginning to shake with a mixture of fear and growing indignation. She didn't even look me in the eye. She just started muttering about how much work she had to cancel and the sacrifices she was making just to stay here and babysit me. The tension reached a boiling point when Leroy walked in with that arrogant smirk he always wears when he thinks he has the upper hand. He went straight to the refrigerator to grab a beer and then turned to me with a look of pure mockery. He told me I should listen to Della because at my age, and after having what he called a little episode, it was best for me to just sit still and stay out of the way. He actually said they were sacrificing their entire vacation just to be my glorified babysitters. His words were like gasoline poured onto a smoldering fire. I realized in that moment that the sacrifice they kept throwing in my face was nothing more than a cover for their own bitterness. They were angry that the $3 million check they felt entitled to had vanished, and now they were stuck with a mother who is no longer a quiet source of funds, but a person with a voice and a will of her own. I stood as tall as my tired bones would allow and looked both of them directly in the eyes. I told them clearly that I never asked them to abandon their lives for me, and if they felt that being here was such a miserable burden, the door was wide open for them to leave. I made it known that I would not allow anyone, especially not my own children, to strip away my right to make decisions for myself in the very house I built and paid for. Della looked stunned because she had never seen me this resolute or this unwilling to play the role of the victim. A thick, heavy silence settled over the room as a massive crack formed between us. One side filled with her fake concern and hidden greed, and the other side anchored by my own rising self-respect. In the middle of that suffocating atmosphere, the doorbell rang, and it felt like a lifeline being thrown to a drowning woman. It was Stephen Wright, my attorney, and a trusted old friend of the family, who has always seen me for exactly who I am. Stephen walked in wearing a perfectly tailored suit, his sharp eyes immediately taking in Della's panicked expression and Leroy's sullen face. His presence was like a cool breeze that instantly settled the anger in my heart and reminded the two of them that I was far from alone in this world. He greeted me warmly and stated in a voice that was quiet but held the power of the law that he had brought the documents regarding the company management and my asset records that I had requested. When Della tried to interrupt, he politely but firmly cut her off, asserting that Mrs. Clark was fully capable of managing her own private affairs. Watching the color drain from her face and seeing Leroy finally go silent gave me a rush of energy that I haven't felt in years. I may be recovering from a health scare, but my power and my dignity are things that no one is allowed to touch. The sound of Stephen's car door closing left behind a silence so heavy it felt like it might swallow the whole living room. I stood there, clutching the legal folder to my chest, like it was the only shield I had left to protect me from the people I once called my own flesh and blood. Leroy didn't even bother to keep up the act of being the concerned son-in-law anymore. He slammed his half-empty beer can into the trash with a sharp metallic bang that sounded like a starting pistol for a new kind of war. Della was leaning against the kitchen counter, her eyes red and swollen, but they weren't filled with tears for her mother. They were burning with the pure rage of someone who just watched a massive fortune slip through her fingers. "Who do you think you are bringing a lawyer into this house?" Leroy roared as he took 3 aggressive steps toward me. The smell of cheap beer on his breath was so strong it made my head spin. "You are old, Mary. You are confused. Or maybe that little stroke you had finally burned out the last few brain cells you had left." He started mocking me right there in my own hallway, calling me a ticking time bomb and a senile old woman who didn't know what was good for her. He looked at me with such genuine disgust that I felt my stomach turn. Dela didn't say a word to stop him. She just stood there, her voice cracking with a different kind of bitterness. "Do you even realize what you have done, Mother? You have ruined everything. The honeymoon, the house, our entire future. All of it is gone, just because you had to be so incredibly selfish." Every word she spat out felt like a physical blow to my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. My heart began to race in a frantic, irregular rhythm, and a sharp, stinging pain started to crawl down my left arm. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to stay upright, because I refused to collapse in front of them and give them the satisfaction of seeing me weak again. I could feel a cold sweat soaking through the back of my blouse, and a terrifying numbness started to creep up the side of my face, a sign that my blood pressure was spiraling out of control. But strangely enough, in the middle of that storm of insults, my mind suddenly became crystal clear. I looked at Leroy, and then at Dela, and I finally saw them for exactly who they were. They weren't my family. They were just two strangers trying to tear apart a sick woman for whatever they could scavenge. "Enough," I said. My voice was barely a whisper, but it was as sharp and cold as a razor blade. I didn't scream, because I didn't have the energy left for it, but I stood my ground. This is my home. This is my property. And this is my life. If you two only see caring for me as a business transaction to get your hands on my money, then that transaction is officially over. I turned my back on them and began the long, slow climb up the stairs, taking it one agonizing step at a time, while Leroy shouted curses at my back. When I finally reached my bedroom and locked the door, I collapsed onto the bed, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I was completely exhausted, but for the first time in years, I felt like I had actually won. I had survived the truth, and the truth had finally set me free. The chest pains from the night before had finally subsided, leaving behind a clarity that was both cold and terrifying. I woke up just as the sun began to crest over the surface of Lake Westlake, casting long golden shadows across my bedroom floor. This morning, there were no sounds of Leroy's loud, abrasive voice from the kitchen, and no heavy sighs from Dela, designed to make me feel like a burden. Instead, there was only a sharp, clear realization. I knew then that if I did not build a fortress for myself, the people I loved most would, whether by accident or by cruel design, turn the rest of my life into a pile of rubble. I was no longer angry, and the desire to cry had completely vanished. The numbing shock of their betrayal had been replaced by the raw instinct of a builder. I had spent my life on construction sites, and I knew that when the foundation of a structure is cracked, you do not sit and mourn the damage. You reinforce it. You shore up the walls before the whole thing comes crashing down around you. The moment the doors to Stephen Wright's office opened, I was already there, waiting in the lobby. Sitting in that room, surrounded by the comforting scent of fresh paper and polished oak, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. We weren't there to talk about revenge, because revenge is for people with too much time and not enough purpose. We were there to talk about protection. I sat across from Stephen and spoke in a voice that was as calm as if I were negotiating a contract for 1,000 tons of concrete. I told him I needed to overhaul my entire estate plan. I wanted to change my heirs, and more importantly, I needed to designate a new medical power of attorney. I made it clear to him that I could no longer entrust my life or my health care to people who viewed my illness as nothing more than a financial inconvenience or a hurdle on the way to their inheritance. We went through my old will, line by line. Every word that had once promised a comfortable future for Della and Leroy was carefully replaced. Tearing up that $3 million check at the hospital had only been the beginning of my awakening. Now, I was establishing a strict family trust with ironclad conditions. My assets and the company I had spent my life building would no longer be a treasure chest left wide open for Leroy's laziness or Della's cold pragmatism. I felt a quiet surge of power moving through my veins as I signed page after page of legal documents. This wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration. It was about returning everything to its rightful place and protecting the fruits of my 8 years of widowhood. I was guarding the sweat and the sacrifice of both my husband and myself, and for the first time, I felt like the owner of my own legacy again. The next step in my plan was the house itself. I realized very quickly that I could not recover my health in a space where every corner held the echo of an insult or the threat of a confrontation. I contacted a professional security firm and had them replace every lock in the house with a high-end smart system. I added cameras at every entrance and along the perimeter of the property. As the technicians worked, I stood and watched them with a keen eye. I felt like I was supervising the most important construction project of my entire career. I was turning my home back into a sanctuary. I was creating a space where I could breathe without wondering if someone was standing behind me, waiting for me to stumble. But the most significant change was hiring Martha. I found her through a reputable agency in Texas, and she was exactly what I needed, a professional caregiver who had no expectations of an inheritance and no hidden resentment. Martha didn't look at me with exhaustion or pity. She was there to do a job, and she did it with a quiet efficiency that was incredibly grounding. She monitored my blood pressure, she prepared the low-sodium meals the doctors had ordered, and she made sure I took my medication on the schedule the CVS pharmacist had outlined. Her presence as a neutral professional gave me a sense of security that Della had never been able to provide. I no longer had to look at my daughter's fake tired face every time I needed a glass of water or a bit of help getting to the porch. With Martha there, the transaction was clear and honest, and it allowed me to focus entirely on my own healing. I didn't stop at the house. My reach extended back to Clark & Company, where I had spent so many years in the dirt and the heat. I called a brief meeting with my department heads and my personal secretary. I informed them that due to my ongoing health recovery, I would be strictly limiting family visitors at the office. I made it a matter of policy that any personal issues involving Della or Leroy were not to pass through the front lobby doors. I also spent a long afternoon at Wells Fargo, working with their private banking team to tighten the access to all my business and personal accounts. I ensured that every digital footprint I had was protected with new passwords and two-factor authentication. The days of my children treating my business like their personal piggy bank were over. Slowly and methodically, the feeling of control began to return to my life. I was no longer the frail mother sitting in the dark, waiting for a crumb of affection or a moment of feigned concern. I was Mary Clark once again. I was the woman holding the wheel of her own ship as it moved through a violent storm. Every single step I took, from the legal filings to the security upgrades, made me feel lighter. The fear of a second stroke was still there, tucked away in the back of my mind. But it was no longer accompanied by the terrifying fear of being abandoned or exploited. I was no longer vulnerable because I had built my own safety net. Later that afternoon, I sat out on the back porch and looked toward the horizon. The Texas sky was a deep, bruising purple as the sun began to set. Martha brought me a cup of herbal tea, and the scent of chamomile and honey drifted up to me in the cool air. My phone sat on the small table next to me, but it was silent. I had set up a call filtering system that directed any calls from Della and Leroy straight to a voicemail box that Stephen would monitor. If they wanted to talk about money, they would have to talk to my lawyer. If they wanted to apologize, they could leave a message, and I would decide when and if I was ready to listen. I took a long, slow breath, and for the first time in weeks, my chest didn't tighten with pain. I realized then that healing is not just about the pills you take or the doctors you see. It is about having the courage to walk away from toxic relationships, even when they share your own blood. I was building a new life on a foundation of self-respect and absolute clarity. The walls I had built over the last few days weren't designed to cage me in. They were built to protect the small but resilient spark of life that was starting to grow in my heart again. I was no longer a victim waiting for the end. I was a woman who had reclaimed her power, and I was ready for whatever was coming next. The quietness that settled into my life with Martha was something I had not realized I missed so dearly. There were no more sharp words from Leroy or the heavy, suffocating silences that Della used to use as a punishment. Yet even with the security of my new routines, this massive house in Westlake felt far too quiet for a woman still trying to find her footing after such a deep betrayal. I would sit by the large window, watching the Texas sky change, and I realized that while my new locks protected my body, they could not mend the holes left in my spirit. I was 60 years old, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of being alone in a world I had built for everyone else. The doorbell rang at 5 in the evening, a soft sound that usually meant a package from Amazon or a check-in from the security company. When I looked at the monitor, I saw Emma standing there. She was the widow of a man who had worked the construction sites with my husband for 20 years. She was holding a large steaming tray of shepherd's pie, the scent of rosemary and baked potatoes drifting through the cracks of the porch. When Martha let her in, Emma didn't wait for me to speak. She simply walked over and pulled me into a hug that felt like it was holding all my broken pieces together. She didn't ask about the $3 million check or the legal drama. She only asked if my legs were still bothering me and if I had eaten a real meal today. In that moment, the smell of that simple pie was worth more to me than all the luxury of the Westlake ballroom, because it came with the one thing I had lacked, which was sincere love. Our quiet moment was interrupted when Martha's phone buzzed with an alert from the gate. It was Della. She was standing there into the intercom, demanding to be let in because she had something urgent to say about her inheritance. I felt my chest tighten, and my pulse began to race, a familiar fear clawing at my throat. But Emma just squeezed my hand and stood up. She walked out onto the porch and faced Della through the iron bars of the security gate. Emma spoke with a voice that was low, but as steady as a mountain. She told Della that her mother was resting, and that if she actually cared about me, she would turn her car around and leave. When Della tried to scream about her rights, Emma reminded her that she had already made her choice when she turned her back on her own mother at that wedding. Watching Della drive away in a cloud of dust, I finally understood that an ally is not just someone who cries with you, but someone who stands as a shield when you are too tired to fight for yourself. That night, I ate every bite of Emma's pie and slept without the fear of the shadows. Have you ever felt alone, only to have someone step in right when you needed them most? Sometimes, a warm meal or a kind embrace restores our strength. Tell me about the person who became your light in a dark time. Please share in the comments. I'm here to listen and honor those who show us what real family means. After that warm evening with Emma and the comforting scent of her shepherd's pie, I had hoped I could finally find a small corner of peace to recover. But the instincts of a woman who spent decades managing hundreds of construction projects across Texas wouldn't allow me to just look away. There was something that didn't sit right in my mind. A tiny, sharp detail about how confidently Leroy had declared I was losing my mind just a few days before. When Martha was finally asleep and a heavy silence draped itself over the Westlake house, I sat down in front of my specialized laptop. The cold blue light from the screen reflected back at my tired face as I began a journey into the dark corners of my own family that I never dreamed I would have to see. I started by digging into our linked personal and business accounts at Wells Fargo. At first, everything looked normal enough, until I noticed a string of small, continuous transactions made throughout the entire week I was stuck in the hospital. These weren't large enough to trigger an automatic alert from the bank, but they were a series of under-the-radar transfers moving into a strange account I didn't recognize. My heart began to beat harder against my ribs as I logged into the remote security camera system for the Clark & Company office. On the very day I was admitted to the hospital, the footage showed Leroy sneaking into my private office at 2 a.m. He wasn't alone. He was with a man I didn't know who was carrying a thick briefcase, and together they were rummaging through my private drawers, taking photos of my corporate seals and legal documents. A wave of pure disgust rose in my throat, because they weren't just waiting for me to pass away. They were actively trying to kill me off legally while I was still breathing. The height of the betrayal was buried in a trash folder of our shared family email that Dela had forgotten to empty properly. I found a draft for a durable power of attorney and a statement of incapacity that had already been prepared. The contents were horrific, as they were seeking to prove that I had early onset dementia and was no longer capable of managing the $40 million assets of my company. Even more bitter was the discovery that they had already contacted a cheap nursing home in a remote suburb, a place with record-low fees and a reputation for terrible service. One email from Leroy to Dela read that they just needed to get the old lady in there and they would have full control of the Westlake estate. He wrote that the $3 million check was just small change compared to what they could get once I signed the papers, while I was on sedatives. I sat there perfectly still, my hands trembling, not from my illness, but from the sheer shock of it all. It turns out their appearance at the hospital wasn't out of love or concern, but they were hovering like vultures, waiting for a signature while I was in a daze. The old navy blue dress they mocked so cruelly at the wedding wasn't just about fashion. It was because that dress reminded them that I was still here, and that I was still the owner of the fortune they felt entitled to. Everything became as clear as a technical blueprint held under a high-power light. Dela's ingratitude and Leroy's thuggish behavior were all part of a plan to liquidate my life to serve their own vanity. The last of my tears for my daughter finally dried up right then and there. In their place came a cold and absolute determination. I picked up my phone and sent a single text to Stephen, my lawyer. I told him we were no longer just playing defense, and that it was time to take the next step we had discussed, because I now had the physical proof of a conspiracy to commit fraud. I took a long, deep breath of the cool Texas night air. My body might be recovering, but my soul was just reborn in the truth. They thought I was just a senile old woman they could lead around by the nose, but they forgot one thing. I am the woman who built this empire from nothing after my husband died, and I will be damned if I let these emotional abusers tear it down. After that long, grueling night of facing the brutal evidence of Della's and Leroy's conspiracy, my soul felt like a construction site that had just been torn apart by a massive hurricane, leaving behind nothing but wreckage and jagged cracks. The blue light from my laptop slowly faded to black, giving way to the gray and misty dawn of another Texas autumn morning. I realized I could not stay in my bedroom for a single minute longer, because the air there still felt thick with the suffocating scent of betrayal. My legs, though, still somewhat unsteady from the lingering effects of my stroke, seemed to guide me on their own. They led me down the quiet hallway to the very end, where the study door stood waiting. This was Frank's private space, and I had kept it exactly as it was for the last 8 years. The wooden hinges gave a soft, familiar squeak as I pushed the door open, sounding like a quiet welcome home. Instantly, the scent of Frank surrounded me. That deep, comforting aroma of cedar wood, mixed with the sharp metallic smell of machine grease that always clings to a builder, and just a faint, lingering hint of the tobacco that had seeped into the very walls over the decades. I sat down in his old, worn leather chair, the place where he used to spend hours hunched over blueprints and design specs before coming to bed. On the desk, everything remained untouched. His metal tape measure, its edges smoothed by years of use, lay next to a framed photo of us taken at our very first job site in Houston. In that picture, Frank was laughing, his broad, strong arm wrapped tightly around my shoulders. We were both covered in Texas dust and sweat, but our eyes were absolutely shining with hope. I reached out and traced the lines of his face through the cool glass, feeling as if the warmth of his hand was still there somewhere, shielding me from the storms outside. "Oh, Frank," I whispered into the stillness, my voice breaking in the shadows. "Do you see what our daughter is doing?" Staring at those old blueprints, my mind began to drift back to the year 2008, when the Great Recession swept across the country like a plague. Clark and Company was on the verge of total collapse back then. I remembered the endless nights we spent right here in this room, sharing a single piece of dry bread and drinking cheap iced tea, just so we could save every spare penny to pay our laborers. Frank had sold his favorite Ford truck, his pride and joy, and even took on extra night shifts at a scrapyard just to keep our dream from crumbling. He used to tell me that money can be lost, Mary, but honor and kinship are things we must protect at all costs. Back then, Della was just a little girl, and we did everything in our power to shield her from the harsh reality of our struggle. We scraped together every cent to make sure she had the best of everything. I realized now, with a bitter ache in my chest, that our overprotection had accidentally raised a utilitarian soul, a person who only knows how to take and has no concept of the sweat and sacrifice poured into these drawings. I stood up and walked to the corner of the room to pull Frank's old leather jacket from the rack. I slipped it on, and the weight of the heavy leather felt like a solid embrace from the past. My fingers brushed against a small, yellowed piece of paper, tucked deep in the pocket. It was Frank's handwriting. It said, "For Mary, the most resilient builder I have ever known, and never let anyone dim the light in your eyes." That message from 10 years ago felt like a jolt of electricity moving down my spine. I realized that Frank would never want me to collapse under the weight of their cruelty. He had spent his entire life building a solid foundation for this family, and now it was my duty to protect that foundation from the predators who wanted to tear it down, even if those predators were my own flesh and blood. The agonizing pain of the betrayal began to transform into a strange and powerful peace. I no longer felt like a frail old woman fighting an illness alone in the dark. I was Mary Clark, the wife of Frank Clark, and I carried within me the grit of a woman who had stood beside her husband through the darkest economic hours of our history. I took off the jacket and hung it back in its place with a newfound sense of reverence. I walked out of that study, but this time my back was straight and my eyes were focused. I was no longer afraid of Leroy's legal traps or Della's cold manipulation. My strength didn't come from the $3 million or the Westlake mansion. It came from the values Frank had left behind and the fact that I had lived a life of honesty and self-respect. I went down to the kitchen and brewed a cup of strong black coffee, the scent of it waking up my senses for the final journey ahead. I was not going to let them put me in a nursing home, and I was not going to let them touch a single brick of this empire with their lies. "Thank you, Frank," I whispered, as the bright morning sun finally burned through the mist on the lake. The battle ahead would not involve guns or shouting, but it required the courage of a builder who knows the true value of every line on the blueprint. And I, Mary Clark, was finally ready to execute the most important design of my life, a blueprint for justice and dignity. The strength I gathered from Frank's old belongings and the simple message he left in his jacket pocket was still a warm ember in my chest. But the cold reality of Westlake never lets you stay in your memories for long. The roar of an engine outside my gate that afternoon was not the familiar purr of my old Camry, but the aggressive sound of an invasion. I stood by the window and watched as Della and Leroy climbed out of their car, accompanied by a man I had never seen before. He wore a cheap gray suit and carried a heavy leather briefcase that looked like it held the weight of a death sentence. I knew in my gut that this was the final test of the resilience I had just begun to rebuild. My chest tightened, not from fear this time, but from a searing rage as I realized they were bold enough to bring a total stranger into my home to pick apart the remains of my privacy. They did not bother to knock. Leroy tried to use his old security code to get in, but the high-end smart system I had just installed let out a piercing, ear-splitting alarm that shattered the quiet of the neighborhood. It was the sound of my boundaries finally being enforced. When Martha opened the door on my command, they burst in like debt collectors coming for a soul. Della wouldn't even look me in the eye. She just fussed with her silk handkerchief, while Leroy wore a fake triumphant smile that made my skin crawl. He introduced the stranger as Dr. Miller, a supposed expert in cognitive capacity, and claimed they were only here because they were worried about me. He had the nerve to say that the stroke had changed me and that I was no longer the woman I used to be. He told me they were there to finalize the guardianship papers for my own good. The air in the living room felt like it was being sucked out through the floorboards. This man Miller sat down and started hitting me with trap questions as if I were a child or a suspect in a crime. He asked me if I knew what day it was and if I remembered any large checks I had signed recently. They were trying to build a record of dementia and paranoia right there in my own foyer. Every question felt like a thick rope tightening around my neck, trying to pull away my right to be a free citizen. I looked at Della, searching for even a tiny spark of the little girl I used to tuck in at night. But she just stared down at her expensive designer shoes, probably wondering if my bank account would cover the next pair. A sharp pain flared in my chest, and for a second, I felt that old familiar helplessness trying to drag me down. But then, I pictured Frank's blueprints. A solid structure doesn't fall just because there are a few cracks in the paint. I took a slow, deep breath and gave Martha a nod to turn on the speakerphone on the table. The calm and steady voice of Stephen Wright, my lawyer, filled the room, cutting through their amateur theater like a knife. I reached into my folder and pulled out the records I had found in the middle of the night. I asked Miller if I should call him doctor, or if he preferred to be addressed as the legal assistant who was disbarred in Dallas for forging documents. The room went absolutely ice cold. Leroy's face turned from a smug grin to a pale, ghostly white, and then a deep, furious purple. I stood up straight and looked that man directly in his eyes. I told them I had the proof of their office break-in and their emails discussing how to drug me so I would sign over my life. I had the records of their plan to dump me in the Cedar Park nursing home while they liquidated my company and sold the house. My anger wasn't a scream anymore. It was a cold, calculated force. I was no longer a victim of their emotional abuse. I was the master of the facts. Della began to sob loudly, claiming she was only following Leroy's lead and that she was just worried. But the time for her crocodile tears was long gone. I looked at my daughter and told her I knew she had signed the transfer papers for the Westlake house over to Leroy while I was still lying in the hospital, trapped in a CT scanner. Leroy looked like he wanted to lunge for the papers in my hand, but Martha stepped firmly between us, a silent wall of professional protection. Knowing I had allies who stood their ground gave me a surge of strength that moved through my body like fire. I told them they had exactly 5 minutes to leave my property before the security team and the police arrived. Leroy spat out a few more curses, calling me a bitter old woman. But his words felt like nothing more than wind hitting a steel skyscraper. As they stumbled out the door and back to their car, I felt a massive weight lift off my spirit. I had been pushed into a corner and attacked with the filthiest tactics imaginable. But I had not broken. I had protected my dignity, and more importantly, I had protected the legacy that Frank had trusted me with. Casey understands how painful it is to realize someone you love is trying to control your life. Have you ever had to choose between family and the truth? What do you think about Mary's decision to protect herself through legal action? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice may give strength to another woman who needs it. 2 weeks had passed since the storm in my living room, and the air in Westlake seemed to grow thick with the anticipation of a final judgment. I spent those days resting and gathering my strength under the watchful and kind eyes of Martha and Emma. With every passing hour, my heartbeat became more steady, and my thoughts grew as sharp as the edges of the high-rise buildings in downtown Austin. I was no longer that broken mother standing in the middle of a wedding ballroom with a check in my hand and a plea for love in my eyes. This morning, as I put on my tailored black suit, the one I used to wear when signing multi-million-dollar construction contracts back when Frank was alive, I looked at myself in the mirror and finally saw the Mary Clark I had almost lost. Stephen Wright was waiting for me at his law office in the heart of Austin, where the scales of justice would finally be balanced to end the years of quiet abuse I had endured. The conference room at Stephen's office was flooded with a bright Texas sunlight, but a coldness still hung in the air the moment I stepped inside. Della and Leroy were already seated on the opposite side of a long, polished oak table. Leroy looked restless, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an exit, while Della tried her best to maintain the look of a wounded daughter, constantly dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that remained perfectly dry. Their presence didn't make my chest tighten with pain anymore. I looked at them the same way I would look at a series of dangerous cracks in a blueprint, something that needed to be fixed immediately or removed entirely before the whole structure collapsed. Stephen began the meeting by laying out the evidence of their financial exploitation and the calculated attempt to manipulate my medical guardianship. He placed copies of the emails, the recorded phone calls, and the verification of that fake Dr. Miller on the table with a firm finality. Leroy looked like he wanted to jump up and shout some insult, but Stephen's hard stare and my own absolute silence kept him pinned to his chair. Stephen spoke in a voice that was low but carried the full weight of the law, stating that what they had done was more than just a moral betrayal. It was a serious violation of Texas elder protection statutes. I took a deep breath, feeling the solid ground beneath my feet and the strange peace in my soul. I looked directly into Della's eyes, the daughter I once loved more than my own life. I began to speak, and my voice sounded incredibly calm, even to my own ears. I told her that I had built this company and saved every cent to ensure she would never have to know the kind of bone-deep poverty and struggle her father and I went through in our youth. But I had come to realize that the money had become a poison that rotted away her compassion and her honesty. I told her I wasn't there for any kind of payback, because that wouldn't bring me peace. I was there to rescue myself from the chains of a kindness that had been taken for granted. And perhaps I was also rescuing their own souls from a greed that had no bottom. Della started to sob then, and this time they were real tears of fear, because she finally realized the well had run dry. She started talking about family and old memories, but the words sounded hollow and meaningless after everything they had done in the dark. I handed Stephen one last document, which was my final decision to terminate the residency at the Westlake estate and to cut off all future inheritance unless they met strict conditions of financial independence and professional therapy. I told them as clearly as I could that they had exactly 30 days to move out of my house and find a place of their own. Every single living expense from this moment forward would have to be paid for by their own hard work, instead of leaning on the sweat and sacrifice of my life. I made it known that I would not provide another dime for a luxury lifestyle that was built on the exploitation of my health and my trust. Leroy shouted something about taking me to court, but Stephen just gave him a cold smile and pointed to the massive stack of evidence on the table. As I stood up and walked out of that room, I felt a massive, invisible weight being lifted from my shoulders for the very first time in 8 years. I didn't look back, even though I could hear Della calling my name with a voice full of regret. True grace doesn't mean letting people continue to walk all over you in the name of family. As I stepped out into the lobby, the wind from the Colorado River blew past me, carrying the scent of real freedom and a brand new start. I wasn't afraid of another health scare, because I had finally removed the biggest source of stress from my life. I am Mary Clark, and I have just completed the most difficult design of my life, which was a blueprint for an independent and dignified future. The halls of the Travis County Courthouse are massive and imposing, lined with towering white marble columns that seem to hold the weight of 1,000 stories. Every single step I take today rings out against the cold stone floor, sharp and clear, like a final declaration of my existence. After that meeting in Stephen's office, Della and Leroy still refused to back down, clinging to one last desperate attempt to challenge my sanity and my control over the life I built. They forced us to stand before a judge to have a stranger decide if I was still a whole person. I don't feel the same terrifying tremble that gripped me back at the Mayo Clinic. Today, I am wearing Frank's old leather jacket over my professional suit, and it feels like a suit of invisible armor, protecting me from the cold. It reminds me of my roots, of the dirt and the sweat and the sheer grit it took to survive the early years. I am not here for revenge or to see them punished. I am here to reclaim the voice that was stolen by the greed of my own flesh and blood, and to finally stand as the master of my own fate. Courtroom 4 is perfectly silent as we enter. Judge Thompson, a woman with eyes as sharp as a hawk's and a presence that demands absolute respect, slowly flips through the thick folder of evidence Stephen has spent weeks perfecting. Della is sitting there across the aisle, looking smaller than I have ever seen her. She isn't wearing the expensive designer clothes I paid for today. She looks lost and out of place in the sterile atmosphere of the law. Leroy is a different story. He is sweating through his shirt, and he cannot bring himself to look at the bench, or even look me in the eye. Stephen begins his presentation with a quiet and steady power. He doesn't use grand words or dramatic gestures. He simply lays out a timeline of their betrayal. He speaks of the day I was admitted to the hospital for pure exhaustion, the night Leroy snuck into my office, and the cold proof of their secret communications with that remote nursing home. Each fact he presents feels like a solid brick being laid to build an unshakable wall of truth. When he plays the audio recording of Leroy mocking me in my own living room, calling me a senile old woman, the very air in the room seems to freeze. That insult was more than just a personal wound. It was a direct attack on the value of a human being who has given her entire life to support her family. Judge Thompson eventually takes off her glasses and looks directly at Della and Leroy. Her voice is not loud, but it carries a terrifying weight that makes everyone in the room sit a little straighter. She tells them that in the state of Texas, we respect the autonomy and the dignity of our elders. She makes it clear that what they have done was never about caring for a mother who was ill, but was instead a systematic and cruel effort to strip a competent citizen of her assets and her pride. She pauses for a moment, her gaze shifting toward me with a quiet and profound respect. She acknowledges that I spent 8 years holding a construction company together, contributing to our community, and worrying about the future of my children. In return, she says, they tried to turn me into a prisoner in my own home. She calls it a betrayal of trust in its worst possible form. Her words are like a beam of pure light cutting through the darkest parts of my soul, finally washing away the guilt I had carried. For months, I had wondered if I was a bad mother. But hearing the law of the land declare my worth finally sets me free from that self-doubt. The final verdict is delivered with a sharp and final clarity. Every single request for guardianship filed by Della and Leroy is denied in its entirety. The eviction notice for the Westlake estate is granted and takes effect immediately. Most importantly, the court officially confirms my absolute right to self-determination over every cent I own and every medical decision I make. When the judge finally brings down her gavel, the sound of that heavy wood hitting the bench is like the sound of a final shackle falling to the floor. Della breaks down into real tears this time, but I do not reach out to comfort her. I look at her, and I see a 30-year-old woman who finally needs to learn how to grow up and face the consequences of her own choices. I have given her everything a mother could possibly provide, and today, my final gift to her is the truth and the weight of her own responsibility. I hope that one day she will understand, I whisper as I walk past her chair. There is no anger left in me, only a vast and quiet sadness that I have finally accepted. I walk out of that courtroom and into the bright lobby, with Stephen walking beside me in his usual calm and steady way. Emma and Martha are waiting there for me, and their smiles are the warmest things I have ever seen. Emma reaches out and squeezes my hand, telling me that it is finally over and that I have done it. We walked together out onto the wide stone steps of the courthouse. The Austin sky is a brilliant cloudless blue today, and the Texas autumn wind is blowing across the plaza, carrying the scent of dry grass and the sweet taste of freedom. I take a long, deep breath and feel my chest expand with a lightness I haven't felt in years. The sharp pain that used to flare up in my heart is completely gone, replaced by a strong and steady beat. I am no longer afraid of what the future holds, and I am no longer burdened by the people who tried to pull me down into the dark. I look down at my hands, the scarred and calloused hands of a builder, and I know that I still have the strength to build the next chapters of my life on a foundation of self-respect and real friendship. We walk toward the car, leaving the gray buildings behind and heading toward the sun as it shines brilliantly over the surface of the lake. A full year has passed since the sound of Judge Thompson's gavel closed the darkest chapter of my life. My Westlake home is no longer a lonely fortress. It has finally become a true sanctuary. The gentle afternoon sun stretches across the lush green grass where I am gathered with my dearest friends to prepare for our Thanksgiving feast. I take a deep breath of the crisp air and feel my heart beating with a steady, healthy rhythm. This is the miraculous healing that happens when the soul is finally released from heavy chains and allowed to breathe again. In the kitchen, the warm scent of roasting turkey and sweet pumpkin pie fills the air, while Emma laughs and Martha carefully arranges bright sunflowers in a silver vase. Stephen just arrived, carrying a bottle of fine wine and a smile that says everything is right with the world. We may not share the same blood, but we are a family. We are a chosen family, built on a foundation of mutual respect and unconditional love. I look out the window at the driveway, where my old Camry has been replaced by a modern SUV that keeps me safe on the road. I still receive letters from Della occasionally, from her small apartment near Cedar Park. She is learning how to be an adult now, working a retail job, and finally understanding the true value of a hard-earned dollar. I am no longer filled with anger. I pray for her every single day. But I also know exactly where my boundaries are. I have learned that loving someone sometimes means letting them walk their own path alone, while I deserve to enjoy these peaceful years surrounded by those who truly cherish my presence and my history. The story of Mary Clark comes to an end here, but it opens a profound door for all of us. Family is not always about the blood in your veins. It is about the behavior and the kindness we show to one another. Mary was brave enough to choose herself, her dignity, and her health over a life of quiet suffering disguised as family duty. The greatest lesson I have taken from her journey is this: never let anyone, not even those closest to you, make you feel like you are a burden or an inconvenience. You are the absolute master of your own life, the assets you created, and the heart you carry. Real healing only begins when we dare to let go of the things that wound our souls, to make room for kindness and peace to take root. Did Mary's journey remind you of a moment in your own life? How do they make you feel about the choices we have to make for our own survival? Most importantly, what is the one lesson you are taking away from this experience? Please share your heart in the comments, because Casey is always here to listen and to stand with you.